everyone. Hopefully you guys can hear me okay. I'm gonna go ahead and link the slides really quickly. Yeah. All right, so the link to the slides are in the chat. If for some reason they don't work, let me know. So before we get started, I want to talk about your first exam today. So you have an exam 1 today, and exam 1 is going to cover every chapter that we've covered so far, including the material from this week. So considering that this is your first exam, let me know if you need more time preparing, and I'm more than happy to extend that for you. So the way it works is that your exam, for the most part, most of the questions are just going to be from like your knowledge checks. So as long as you've been staying on top of your knowledge checks and you've been doing your knowledge checks, then you should be fine. Right, so after the end of live session today, I'm gonna post a practice exam for you to try out and see how well, like how much information you remember. But for the most part, a majority of the questions are ones that you've seen before. So hopefully that wouldn't make it as daunting. I know there's like a lot of chapters involved, but I'm gonna make a practice where you can kind of try and see where you're at. The actual exam itself is gonna be like 8 questions for the most part per chapter, and you have like a minute per question, a minute 20 seconds per question, which is how much they get on site. So that's where that number is coming from. There is a time limit, and it's going to be a minute and 20 seconds per question. So 8 questions per chapter, minute 20 seconds per question, and everything will be uploaded as soon as live session is completed. Any questions from you guys? No. Carson, if you think of anything, feel free to just post.
You think it's going to be bad luck or something?
I don't like, yeah, well, you know.
Yeah, feel free to post if you have any questions in the chat, and then I'll take a look at that. But with that being said, we're going to start today with, not this chapter. Okay. Right, so we're going to do this. Oops. We're doing chapter 1 and 6 today. So ignore what it says here. We're just doing chapter 1 and 6. So hopefully you guys can see my slides. Okay, cool. So we've been talking about things on a cellular level, like we were talking about atoms before, and how atoms can come together and make molecules, and then how numerous molecules can come together to make a macromolecule. So macro is just like large scale. And these macromolecules can make this organelle, where we talk about cells, how cells come together to make tissues. So we're just gonna build on top of this hierarchy. And we're gonna talk about our first organ system today, which is gonna be the skin. Right, so before we do that, we're gonna cover some introductory information. So a very big concept in physiology is this idea of homeostasis. And homeostasis is when our body tries to maintain a very stable internal environment. So what that means is that, you know, I think for the most part, we're in like you guys are in Southern California, but imagine that you move to New York. Obviously the temperatures are very different. But your internal body temperature will remain the same. Your blood pH will remain the same. Your level of glucose in the blood will remain the same. So the body constantly works to maintain a very strict internal environment. right? So this means that our temperature is always the same. Our internal body temperature is always the same, right? It doesn't matter what temperature the outside is, your body tries its best to maintain a constant internal environment. And then apply this idea to everything else in the body, like the levels of calcium in the blood, levels of glucose in the blood, levels of hormones in the blood. Everything is tightly regulated, and we call that regulation homeostasis. So there's three parts to a homeostatic mechanism. You have a receptor. So a receptor is something that detects stimuli. You have a control center, and that's going to be like the brain of the operation, and it actively works to maintain a set point, right? This set point is called baseline conditions. It's called the homeostatic set points. Just know that whenever we're talking about like a set point, homeostatic set point, it's a certain number, certain quantity. And we're going to look at an example in a bit. So lastly, you have an effector. So when things do change, you need a driver to return conditions back to the set point, right? So if things get too cold, if your internal body temperature drops, you need something to bring that body temperature back up to its original set point. And so that's what the muscles and glands are for. These guys are both effectors, and they respond to the control center, and they carry out changes in the internal environment. So what typically happens is that the receptor will detect a change in the set point. It's gonna send that information to the control center. The control center is then gonna tell the effector to, hey, do something, the body temperature is too low. Then the effector is the one that brings the body temperature back up to its homeostatic set point. And so this idea is very similar to how a thermostat works. So you guys have a thermostat at home, right? You set it at a certain temperature. So for example, here it's set at 22 degrees Celsius. And you guys know what happens with the thermostat, right? Whenever there's a deviation in the room temperature, that's going to activate the thermostat. Because the whole point of a thermostat is to keep the room at a very constant temperature, right? In this case, it's going to be 22 degrees Celsius. So hypothetically, let's imagine that homeostasis is disturbed, right? There's an increase in room temperature. This information is going to be received by the receptor. The receptor will then send the information to the brain, which is the thermostat. Thermostats will then send commands to the effector. The effector is the air conditioner. So if the room gets too hot, the receptor receives that information, sends it to the thermostat. Thermostat will then activate the air conditioner, and the air conditioner will restore homeostasis, right? It will restore the temperature set forth by the thermostat. So this is going to decrease the room temperature. So let's apply this to something in physiology. So again, we were talking about body temperature. So why don't we keep with that theme of body temperature? So imagine that homeostasis is disturbed, right? There's an increase in body temperature for some reason. This is going to be sensed by the thermoreceptors in the body. These thermoreceptors are going to send information to the control center. Specifically, as we'll learn in future chapters, the control center for temperature is the hypothalamus, which resides in the brain. That control center is going to send information, is going to send commands to the effectors, right? Because the control center realizes now, okay, the receptors are telling me that the body temperature is higher than what it typically is. I'm going to send commands to the effectors, right? And what are the effectors that help to regulate body temperature? Those are going to be the blood vessels and the sweat glands in the skin. So what happens is that these effectors are activated. The blood vessels, they're going to be dilated. Right? The blood vessels are going to get bigger. And you can see this as well if you exercise, if you ran, you notice that your face just becomes really, really red. That's because the blood vessels on the surface of your face are dilated, right? So that means that they get bigger in size. And so when they dilate, this allows heat to escape from your blood vessels. Another thing that we do to combat increase in body temperature is sweat, right? So you guys know that already. And so these two things are going to restore our body temperature back to its original set point, which is, around between 36 and 37 degrees Celsius. Right? So homeostasis is restored. And so what happens when there's a decrease in body temperature? There's a drop and the body temperature reaches below 36.7. We are outside of homeostasis, right? This is not what the body temperature prefers to be at. So the receptors are going to receive this information. They're going to send it to the control center in the brain. The control center is going to send commands to the effectors, telling the effectors to do something about it, right? There's a decrease in body temperature. We need to do something about it. And so what does the body do? The blood vessels will constrict, right? So instead of dilating, they will constrict. They become smaller, right? So what this does is that it will trap heat within the body. And another thing that happens, of course, is we have to cancel out the sweat glands. We're not going to sweat. Sweating is something that is done to decrease body temperature, right? So we're gonna inactivate these guys, and also the other thing we're gonna do, as you guys know, we're gonna shiver, right? So we're gonna contract our skeletal muscles rapidly, and that's gonna cause shivering to occur. And shivering actually will trigger an increase in body temperature, right? When muscle contracts, it releases a bit of heat, and so that's why we shiver, to help to restore our body temperature back to its homeostatic set points. Right, so here are all the things that are done by the effectors, and eventually what will happen is that we're gonna be restored. We're gonna return back to our set point. The whole point of these mechanisms is to make sure that we are constantly at the set point. Right, if there's any deviations, the body will accommodate for that, but eventually we have to be restored back to this homeostatic set points. And again, the reason why the body is so picky with things like body temperature is because all the proteins and enzymes in your body, they prefer to be at a very specific temperature. And if there's any deviation from this core temperature for too long, then the proteins will start to degrade. So I'm gonna have you guys take a look at this question. So what is the stimulus gonna be? I'm not gonna open a poll. I'm not gonna open a poll or anything, but kind of think about this for a few seconds. Think about what the receptors are, think about the control center, think about the effectors for a few seconds. So I'm gonna have you guys kind of think about this, and we're gonna talk about this in like a few seconds or so. So just make sure that you guys can determine these. Right, so let's go ahead and take a look at these questions together. So the first question is, what is the stimulus, right? What is causing all these physiological mechanisms to take place? And somebody mentioned, Jody, I think, mentioned that it was going to be the change in body temperature, right, which is the correct answer. In this scenario, what is the receptor going to be? And it's stated here for you in this diagram, the receptor is going to be the body's temperature sensors, right? So in both scenarios, whether it be an increase or decrease, both of these changes in temperature are going to be sensed by the thermal receptors in the body. And so what is the control center? The control center, again, in this diagram, tells us specifically that it's the thermoregulatory center in the brain. And as we'll learn in future chapters, this is going to be the hypothalamus. Last question, what is the effector? The effector, again, is listed out for you. Two of the choices are correct, right? You have the blood vessels and the sweat glands. Those are the effectors, right? The effector is always either a muscle or a gland. You might be thinking, okay, well, blood vessel is not really a muscle, but there's smooth muscle surrounding the blood vessel that allows it to dilate and constrict. And we're going to talk about that in like a future chapter on muscles. Rule of thumb is that effectors are always going to be either a muscle or a gland. And the thing that's causing the changing in shape of the blood vessels is going to be the smooth muscle, right? So in either scenario, you realize that the effectors, again, are either the sweat glands or the blood vessels. If it's too hot, sweat glands are activated, blood flow is increased, which means that the blood vessels are dilated, they're bigger, allows more blood flow. And again, you see this when you turn red, you exercise, your body's trying to get rid of all that heat. Another thing is that when you get cold, you might have realized that your face turns really pale. That's because those blood vessels are now constricted. Right? We're constricting the blood vessels. We're trying to trap as much heat as possible within the body. Right, so 2 choices are correct, C and D. So hypothetical scenario here, your muscles produce heat during strenuous exercise. Which of the following occurs, right? Again, this is just hinting at the fact that we're gonna experience an increase in core temperature when we exercise, right? So this is physiologically relevant, right? We've all exercised before. That's gonna increase the core temperature of the body, right? What's gonna happen in that regard? Again, just follow this diagram through. What's the first thing that has to happen whenever there's an increase in body temperature? The receptors are the first to know. They're going to tell the command center, the command center / control center is going to send commands to the effectors. The effectors will then help to bring our body temperature back down to its original body temperature. Right? So all these examples are correct. The blood vessels will dilate so that heat can escape. The sweat glands produce sweat. The thermoregulatory center sends commands to the effectors. All these are correct. So just make sure as you're going through this on your own, as you're looking through these questions on your exercises, that you're able to identify the receptors and control centers and effectors. Sometimes the receptors and control center are the same thing. And so sometimes they're the same thing. They're the same organ, essentially. Like the pancreas, for example, the pancreas has receptors on it that will respond to any change in blood glucose level. And it's also the control center, right? Because as well as the effector, because the pancreas will sense a change in glucose, right? As receptors for that. It helps to maintain a certain set points, right? So that makes it a control center. And whenever it senses that blood glucose is high, it's gonna release insulin, right? The pancreas will release insulin. So it's also an effector. So it's interesting, but if there's ever an example like that, it's going to be very clear to you because I know that we haven't really delved into like what everything does yet. So if it were to come to that, if I were to say, hey, the pancreas, like what is the receptor of the pancreas, stuff like that, it will be very apparent to you what it is. So here's another example. You're trekking through the Antarctic and you forget your coat at home, which is true. So basically the opposite that we saw, right? We have a decrease in body temperature. So what has to happen? Will your blood vessels dilate? No, this is something that happens in heat. Will the skeletal muscles start to shiver? Definitely, right? We've all been cold before. We know what happens when it gets cold. Your muscles, they start to contract rapidly, and that's supposed to generate a lot of body heat. And this is true. And then C, homeostasis is restored by increased body heat. So this is also true. So that means that 2 are correct. So again, I want to remind you that blood vessels do not dilate in cold temperature. They will constrict, right? They will shrink in diameter. And the whole purpose of shrinking is to retain body heat in the cold. So thus far, we've been looking at examples of negative feedback. So negative feedback is when there's a change in the stimulus and we will then restore homeostatic set points, right? There's a change in the set points, right, by some type of stimulus. But ultimately what the body does is that it restores the set points, right? So again, increase from the set points, the body will work to decrease the body temperature back to its original set points. That's what we call negative feedback. Effectors, such as the glands and muscles, they will return the conditions back to the original set points. Right? So that means that whenever there's a change, the body works to resolve that change and bring our values back down to its original set points. And the purpose of this is to prevent sudden severe changes in the body. Right? We don't want drastic changes in temperature in the body, right? Because the proteins, again, will denature, right? So we want to maintain a constant internal environment for the body so that everything functions properly. And so this is contrasted against something called positive feedback, which is when deviations from the set point are intensified. And so you might be thinking, what does this mean? Like, how does this result in homeostasis? It's supposed to eventually bring us back to the set points. So examples of these, and we'll cover these in future chapters, is one of the examples is blood clotting, right? So blood clotting triggers a cascade of proteins to help stop the flow of blood as well as to help form the clot. Right? So you have, essentially what you have is when you have damaged blood vessels, proteins will be activated. Those proteins will activate more proteins. All those proteins will work together to activate even more proteins. So you can see how things are escalating, right? They're becoming more and more involved in a way, right? Because you have just a few proteins, and those few proteins will then start to activate more proteins, and then more proteins, more proteins, more proteins. And so this is positive feedback because we have this recruitment, this mass recruitment of all these different proteins. But eventually, what's supposed to happen is that all these proteins are going to help form the clots, and once the clot is formed, we're going to be brought back to homeostasis. Another example of this is during childbirth, right? When the baby exits the cervix, when the baby exits the cervix stretches. That's going to trigger the release of oxytocin from the brain. Oxytocin will cause more uterine contractions, right? So those contractions are going to push the baby out of the cervix even more. And as more the baby is exiting the cervix, it gets bigger, right? The cervix stretches. The more the cervix stretches, the more oxytocin is released from the brain, and the more the uterus will contract, right? So this keeps mounting until the baby's finally out of the vaginal canal. And then we're going to be brought back to the set points. So the thing with positive feedback is that you have this massive deviation, this initial deviation from set points, but eventually this massive deviation serves a purpose. And once it served its purpose, that the body will then return back to its original set points. So again, you'll be given scenarios like this, like elevations of blood glucose is corrected by insulin release from the pancreas. What kind of mechanism is this? Is it like a positive feedback or is it negative feedback? And whenever you see corrected by or things are being brought immediately back to its homeostatic set points, you should be thinking of negative feedback. Right, and then this process happens right after we eat, right? When we're eating, we're bringing in a lot of nutrients. Our blood sugar level, our blood glucose level is rising. But again, what does your body want? Your body always wants a constant level of blood glucose in the body. Too much blood glucose in the body is very dangerous because it can actually mess with the function of the different proteins in the body. And so what has to happen is that as soon as that blood glucose level rises, the pancreas will sense that and release insulin. And the insulin will then decrease blood glucose levels back down to their set points. And so this is an example of negative feedback. And so this is another example that we talked about before, so I'm not going to belabor this point. The skin is penetrated, clotting factors are released. We talked about blood clotting before, right? We talked about how more and more proteins get recruited. Clotting accelerates. You can see that this is a positive feedback loop. So once the issue has been resolved, then we are returned back to set points, right? So we have this very transient, very brief positive regulation where we kind of go beyond the set point, and then once things are resolved, we will then return back to that set point. So this is an example of positive feedback. And so the other part of chapter 1 is getting you familiar with these different terms of the body. So there's a blank diagram where you can practice filling out these terms. I would say make sure you know them really well because for the most part, we use these terms a lot in medicine, right? We don't say armpit, we say axilla. As you go through anatomy, you're gonna be encountering words like axilla, like brachium. You're gonna have to know what body parts this refers to, right? We don't say armpits. We like to make it more complicated. Axilla, right? So if someone says axilla, you should know it's armpits. cephalon or cephaly, cephalic, that's all referring to the head. You know, you can kind of read through these on your own. So just make sure you know these points. The antecubital space, the antecubitus, it's the front of the elbow. That's where blood gets drawn. Right, your umbilicus is here. We don't call it the belly button, unfortunately. Popliteus is the very back of the knee, the popliteal. So just make sure that you're familiar with all these words because they're all going to be fair game. So again, like I said, you have like this diagram that you can practice with that is uploaded on Moodle. You can kind of test yourself. I think that's like the way that I learned it. And the thing is that the more you use it, the more that you'll just have it ingrained in your mind. So just make sure you know these terms. So let's talk about the human body and its two major portions. You have the axial portion. The axial portion has the head, neck, and trunk. So that's the axial portion. And then you have the appendicular portion, which is going to be the upper lower limbs. And so in addition to that, you also have major cavities. When you think of cavities, you probably think of like going to the dentist, or you probably think of like a hole in your tooth. So whenever you see cavity in anatomy, it's a hole, right? It's like just hole. And sometimes this hole can have organs in it. Sometimes this hole can have fluid in it. Just whenever you see cavity, just means some kind of opening, some kind of hole. So the major cavities of the axial portion, so recall that the axial portions, the head, neck, and trunk, are the cranial cavity, which is going to be where your brain is located. You have the vertebral canal, or the spinal cavity, which will contain your spinal cord. You have the thoracic cavity, which houses the lungs and thoracic viscera. And so viscera is probably a word that you have not encountered yet. Viscera is just a fancy way of saying organs. And so when you see viscera, just think organs, right? So that's viscera organs. Abdominal pelvic cavity, which is here below your diaphragm, and that's going to contain all the abdominal as well as pelvic organs. And so the thing, I think it's mentioned here, the thing that separates the two cavities, the thoracic cavity from the abdominal pelvic cavity, is this diaphragm here. And the diaphragm is this flat muscle that helps you breathe, right? So this diaphragm is this major separator between the two cavities. And the thing about the abdominal pelvic cavity is that they're kind of melded together. So some of your abdominal organs will dip below into the pelvic cavity, and sometimes some organs of the pelvic cavity will kind of peek out or poke out into the abdominal cavity. For example, when your bladder gets full, it kind of surfaces into the abdominal cavity. So that's why we kind of combine these words together and refer to this as one uniform cavity. So other cavities, you have the cranial cavity. Again, that's where your brain is. Your vertebral canal, that's where your spine is. So when we look at the thoracic cavity, we can actually even split it up even further. So within the thoracic cavity, you have the pleural cavity, which is going to contain your lungs. You can see that here. It's going to refer to the casing that is surrounding the lungs. We have the mediastinum. So the mediastinum is the region between the lungs and the thoracic cavity, which contains the heart, esophagus, trachea, and thymus gland. So the easy way to remember what is in the mediastinum is that the mediastinum has everything in the thorax but the lungs. So everything in the thorax excluding the lungs, right? So the heart, for example, will be in the mediastinum. The thymus is going to be in the mediastinum. The trachea is also going to be in the mediastinum. The only thing that is not in the mediastinum, again, is going to be your lungs, right? So the mediastinum is like kind of outlined for you. It's kind of like dotted lined. And then within the mediastinum, we have a pericardial cavity, right? So pericardial cavity, cardial is hearts. So pericardial cavity is like between the hearts, but this cavity will encase your hearts, right? Pleura, right? Pleura refers to the lungs, right? Pleura means the lungs. So you have a cavity that is where the lungs are located, and then you have a cavity that is where the heart is going to be located. And then what is separating the thoracic cavity from the abdominal pelvic cavity, again, is your diaphragm. So just make sure you're aware of all those different cavities. You're aware of what organs are located in those cavities because you guys are MRI. And so as we proceed on with the class and start diving into organ systems, you're going to be introduced to a lot of scans, and it's important that you know where you are, right? If you see something that looks like a liver, you should know that you're in the abdominal pelvic cavity, right? There's no liver in the thoracic cavity. And so if we go back to the head, again, we have the cranial cavity. You also have something called sinuses. So the sinuses are very similar to a cavity. The only thing that sets them apart is the fact that they're mucus covered. So imagine a cavity that is lined with mucus, like this mucus layer. That is what a sinus is. So you have these different sinuses here, and I'm sure most of us have gotten sinus infections before. And you might have noticed that when you've had your sinus infection, that these areas get really tender, right? It's because the mucosal layer is inflamed. And that's why, like, sometimes if you like touch yourself in those areas where the sinuses are located, you'll experience a lot of tenderness, right? So you have the frontal sinus here above the eyes. You have the orbital cavities surround the eyes, right? And then above the orbital cavities, you're going to have the frontal sinus. You also have the sphenoidal sinus, kind of here, where the end of the bottom part of your orbital cavity, that's another sinus there. And then you have the nasal cavity, middle ear cavity, which we'll talk about. And then you have the oral cavity, right, which is the opening of your mouth. So thoracic and abdominal pelvic membranes, I'm going to take the time to talk about this idea of this casing that we see around the heart and this casing that we see around the lungs and the intestines as well. So the thoracic and abdominal pelvic cavities are lined with a double-layered serous membrane. So this here, this pericardial cavity is made from these serous membranes. Okay. So let's talk about what these are and their purpose. So these serous membranes, they will secrete serous fluid, right? So it's pretty easy to remember. Serous membranes secrete serous fluid. And this fluid is very slippery. And the purpose of this fluid is to prevent friction between the layers. So a serous membrane is made of two layers. It's going to have the visceral layer, right? The visceral layer is the layer that covers the organ. So you can see here that for the heart is covered by this viscera pericardium, right? Viscera means organ, right? Pretty easy to remember. This layer is attached to the organ itself. And then you have another layer called the parietal layer, and that's going to be the outermost layer, which is going to line the wall of the cavity, right? So it's going to line the wall of the cavity. And so you can see that this membrane, this serous membrane, kind of folds in on itself, right? So you have the visceral pericardium here, and then we have the fold, and this outer part is going to be the parietal pericardium, right? And so these layers, these two membranes, are going to leave a space here in the middle that we call the pericardial cavity. That's a space here. And within this space, this is where you're going to find the serous fluid. Right? This is going to be serous fluid. And again, the purpose of the serous fluid is to prevent friction between the visceral layer and the parietal layer. And the thing about the heart is that it constantly expands and contracts, so it changes shape a lot. So as it expands, it becomes bigger, and it's going to push this visceral pericardium against this parietal pericardium. But luckily for us, there's a fluid here in the pericardial cavity that will prevent friction from occurring between these two membranes. And so whenever there's, for some reason, there's no fluid here in the pericardial cavity, there's going to be increased friction between the visceral and the parietal pericardial membrane. And that's going to lead to something called pericarditis. And this rubbing will produce a lot of pain. And you can actually listen for it with a stethoscope. It sounds like rubbing of like sandpaper on top of each other. And your patient will complain that, you know, like every so often I experience this really sharp pain in my thoracic cavity. And that's because these two membranes are rubbing up on each other and a lot of friction is being generated. There's not fluid there. But luckily for us, there's fluid here that prevents friction from occurring between these two layers. And so this similar setup, it's very similar to like a fist in a balloon. Right? So imagine you have a balloon and you try to punch through the balloon. So your fist is going to be the heart. the balloon is gonna be the serous membrane, right? So the part that is touching, the part of the balloon that is touching your hand, that is the visceral pericardium. The part that is gonna be touching the cavity the heart is in, that's gonna be the parietal pericardium. And between these two membranes is gonna be the airspace. And this airspace is where you're gonna find the serous fluid, right? So again, the whole purpose of this setup that you'll see in the heart, the lungs, as well as the intestines is to reduce friction, right? So I'll list those areas here for you guys. So one of the questions you can encounter is this one. So which does not accurately describe the location of the hearts? And so I'm not gonna open the poll, but I'm gonna have you guys think about this for a few seconds, kind of come up with an answer in your mind, and then we'll talk about it. All right, so let's go ahead and briefly go through this question together because it may show up on your quiz. It's pretty big hint. So which does not accurately describe the location of the heart? And the answer is E, they all describe where the heart is located. So let's talk through each one of these. So we mentioned in the previous slide that the heart is located within the pericardial cavity, right? And so that should be an obvious one. Another one is the mediastinum, because we talked about how the mediastinum contains everything but the lungs. So the mediastinum is going to have the heart in there. The thoracic cavity is going to surround the mediastinum, so of course it's going to have the heart in there. The axial portion, remember that was going to be the head, neck, and trunk. That also is where the heart is located, right? The heart is not located in the appendicular portion; it's located in the axial portion, and so ultimately they all describe where the heart is located, right? So this is very important. And when we do the cardio chapter, I'm going to talk to you guys about different landmarks on the surface of the body that we can use to help locate the heart. Right, so you don't have to use like any like imaging. Like if someone asks you, okay, can you give me like a good scan of the heart? You know exactly where to place like the ultrasound probe, right? Just by using surface landmarks. And so we'll learn more about that in future chapters. And so before we do that, we also have to acquaint ourselves with the different body regions and quadrants. And so since the abdominal pelvic region is so big, we usually separate it into different quadrants. And so we have a right upper quadrant, left upper quadrants, right lower quadrants, left lower quadrant, right? So this is pretty self-explanatory. And so you should know what organs are in which quadrants, right? If they ask you, can you scan for the spleen? I wouldn't be scanning in this quadrant, right? I wouldn't be scanning this quadrant. I'd be scanning in this left upper quadrant, which is where you're going to expect the spleen to be. Likewise, if they ask you, okay, can you scan the liver for me? Can you look at the liver for me? Can you provide a scan of the liver? You're gonna know to look at the right upper quadrant, right? Because that's where the liver is located. Can you tell me where the stomach is located? Can you give me a good scan of the stomach? Again, you should know that it's gonna be here, right? So don't worry, there's like a picture here that shows you where everything is. So know your quadrants, right? Know what is in each quadrant. If you should know, this should be, if you're gonna get anything away from this class, I don't care if you remember cell respiration, if you remember like chemistry, the most important things when you're scanning is to know where things are and what you're looking at. So make sure you know your quadrants, make sure you know what is in the quadrants. For example, like a very common one that they like to talk about a lot is like where the appendix is located. The appendix is going to be located in the right lower quadrants, right? So if you have pain in this quadrant and this pain is very severe, it's very likely that you might have appendicitis and you should go to the hospital, right? So yeah, so Just know your quadrants. We can even be more specific about it, and we can divide it into different regions, right? So you can see here, right hypochondriac region. So the ribs are made up of cartilage. Chondro means cartilage. Hypo means below. So this entire word literally means below the cartilage. Right, so right hypochondriac region below the cartilage. Then you have a left hypochondriac region, right? So again, hypo is below. Chondro refers to cartilage. Some parts of the ribs are made of cartilage. So hypochondriac region is the region that is below the ribs, right? And then right in the middle, you have the epigastric region. So epi means on top of, gastric means stomach, right? So gastric means stomach. So epigastric region literally means the region that is right on top of the stomach. And then you have your lumbar region, right? If you go further down, you have the lumbar region. You guys, I think for the most part, have a good idea of what the lumbar region is, like your lower back, right? Your lumbar region, your right, left lumbar region, and then you have the umbilical region, which is where your belly button is located. Then you have the hypogastric region, this is the pubic region. You have a right inguinal and left inguinal region. Right inguinal, left inguinal region. It's called the inguinal region because you have this inguinal ligament here, just where this crest is located. And then you have the hypogastric, also known as the pubic region. Right, so hypo, again, means below. Gastric means stomach, so this region is below the stomach. Sometimes it's called the pubic region as well, because it's right where the pubis is located. And so here's an example of a question you might encounter, except that a picture will not be provided for you. So a question here is, stomach's located in all listed regions and quadrants except what? So again, I'm going to give you guys some time to kind of think about this, look at the diagram. And not only that, like take note of where everything else is as well, right? Let me give you some time to think about this. All right, so let's take a look at what we came up with. So hopefully, okay, so let's go through each one. So it's located in all the listed regions except which one? So left upper quadrant, we've already talked about that. It is in the left upper quadrant. Right, the quadrants are shown in purple. This purple line here. So we're definitely in the left upper quadrant. Epigastric region, yes. So if we're looking at this red grid here, this is the epigastric region. The regions are in red, the red lines. So yes, yeah, so it is in the epigastric region right there. Left hypochondriac region, yes, definitely in the left hypochondriac region. That's this region here. You can see a part of it is in that region as well. What about the hypogastric region? Hypogastric region we know is down here, right? That's not where the stomach is located. Nothing is even remotely close to the stomach there. So a few things I want you guys to be familiar with, and you guys are probably learning this in your medical terminology class already. But key prefixes and suffixes like chondro means cartilage, hypo means below, gastric means stomach. So this is gonna make anatomy a lot easier if you know the root words. Sometimes you see a word that's like obscenely long, but if you break down the word, you basically know what that word is just by knowing your prefixes and suffixes. And so when I give you this question on the exam, I'm not gonna like trick you guys, right? Because if you look at this picture, right, it looks like the stomach's also in this umbilical region here, right? But it's gonna be obvious. Like I'm gonna ask you something obvious, like liver, and what quadrant is it in, or what region is it in? Right? Just be aware of that. And certain things you can see, like they will encompass all regions. Like you can see that this large intestine, you'll find parts of it in every quadrant, right? And same thing for the small intestine that's here, it's like in every quadrant. So just make sure, just take note of that. Just keep it in the back of your mind. All right, so let's go into some terminology. And this terminology is always going to be used and referenced. So make sure you get a lot of practice with these words because you will hear them a lot in your externships and in the hospital setting. The first word is proximal. So proximal is close to the trunk. So an example of how we would use this word is the shoulder is proximal to the wrist, which means that the shoulder is closer to the trunk than the wrist is. The shoulder is proximal to the wrist, means that the shoulder is closer to the trunk than the wrist is. Distal is the opposite. Distal means farther away from the trunk. So how would you use this? The wrist is distal to the shoulder. And what does that mean? It means the wrist is farther from the trunk than the shoulder. The wrist is farther from the trunk than the shoulder. Right? So these two words always like throw off a lot of students because it's kind of weird using them in like a sentence. But just make sure that you're running through multiple examples, right? You should know that when you use proximal, you put the body part that's closest to the trunk first, right? The shoulder is proximal. When you use distal, the body part that is mentioned first is going to be the body part that's farthest away from the trunk, right? So the wrist is distal to the shoulder. Shoulder is proximal to the wrist. So if we look at this diagram, there's some other words as well that you should also be familiar with. So lateral means away from the midline. Imagine you have a person here. We draw a line right down the center of this person. Lateral means we're moving something away from the midline, right? Moving something away from the midline. Medial means that we're moving towards this midline, this imaginary midline that we drew. So here you have another example of proximal and distal, right? So what I can say here is that this inguinal region is proximal. This inguinal region here is proximal to the knee, right? Or I can say the inguinal region is proximal to the foot. I can say the inguinal region is proximal to the thigh, you know, et cetera, right? Or I can say that the ankle is distal to the inguinal region. I can say the ankle is distal to the knee. Right? The ankle is distal to the thigh, right? And this is another point I want to make. I just want to point this out really quickly. I know it has nothing to do with this diagram, but I think it's important to know. This part, the meaty part right here, that is above the kneecap, we call this part the thigh. The part that's below the kneecap, and it's kind of between the kneecap and the ankle, this is called the leg. And then this part here is the foot, right? A lot of people kind of think that this entire thing is the leg. It's only like this part here, below the kneecap and where the ankle starts, that is the leg, right? So thigh, leg, foot. If we look at the arm, right, you have the arm is only here, this part here, that's between the shoulder and the antecubital space, right? This part is the arm, this is the forearm, these are the hands, right? Just so that we're all on the same page. Okay, so proximal distal, so make sure you know that. Also know that this is, when we say anatomical position, this is the body in anatomical position, kind of facing forward, the palms are open, facing out. This is the body in anatomical position. So whenever you hear anatomical position, you should know that the palms are open. And this is the anterior part of the body. Anterior means front, right? Posterior means back. Right? Another thing that you should know is superior is up top, above, right? Superior is above, inferior is below, right? So that's another orientation term. So I can say that the head is superior to the waist. The head is superior to the knees. Head is superior to the ankle. Or you can say that the ankle is inferior to the head. The knee is inferior to the head. The thigh is inferior to the head, right? So just make sure you're comfortable using these terms. Other directional terms are superficial versus deep. Superficial means surface level, right? Someone who is superficial means that They're only like surface level. Superficial, like a superficial cut is like a paper cut, right? Like a paper cut is like something that's superficial. Superficial means close to the surface, right? Versus something that is deep. Deep means within a cavity or deep inside the body, like a gunshot wound would be a deep wound, whereas a paper cut would be a superficial wound. And so here we're looking at the body from the side, and we can really utilize these terms here. Anterior, like I mentioned before, is front facing. Posterior is back facing. Another word for anterior is ventral. Ventral means the belly side, right? It's the belly side. And dorsal means the back side, right? So just be aware that these words can be used interchangeably. When I want to describe something that's in the back, I can either say posterior to or dorsal to, right? Like I can say that the scapula is posterior to the breast. I can say that the scapula is is a dorsal to the breast, right? So those words are used interchangeably when we're talking about humans. And then anterior, same thing, right? So I can say that the breasts are anterior to the scapula. The breasts are ventral to the scapula, right? Same thing. And then we have caudal, which is towards the tailbone. Caudal versus cranial or cephalic. So these words again are referring to the top of the head. Cranial, kind of like think of like the cranial cavity, right, and refers to the head. Cephalic is another word for the head, so don't be confused. Cephalic and cranial are used interchangeably. So you can say that this is towards the cephalic and this is towards the caudal, right? That basically that's like the context in which those words are used. Most oftentimes you use like superior to or inferior to, but when we specifically want to say toward the head, we will say cephalic, right? Or caudal if we want to say towards the tailbone. So for example, the hips are caudal to the waist, right? Or we can say that the nose is like cephalic to the mouth, right? You can see it's closer to the top of the head. So let's try our hand at this question here. So I'm going to give you guys again some time to think about this. Really take your time, really try to get this question, and then we'll talk about it. All right. So the answer is A, like Javier mentioned. The elbow is proximal to the wrist and distal to the shoulder. So let's take a look on this body. Right, where's the elbow? The elbow is here. It's kind of like the midpoint between the shoulder and the wrist. So that's why I like using it, because you can use proximal and distal for it. So the elbow is going to be proximal to the wrist, meaning that the elbow is closer to the trunk of the body than the wrist is. The elbow is also going to be distal to the shoulder, right? Elbow is also going to be distal to the shoulder, meaning that it's going to be farther away from the trunk than the shoulder is, right? So here's another one that I'm going to leave for you guys to practice with. The crural is referring to the leg, right? So crural is referring to the leg region, which is here. So again, some questions will blend anatomical terminology with positioning, right? So make sure you know all those words on that body part, like like axilla, antecubital, crural, what that is actually referring to on the body, right? So this is an example of that, right? Where's the patella? Patella is going to be the kneecap. The patella is going to be proximal to the crural, right? So that means the patella is closer to the trunk than the crural region is. Crural region is the leg, and the patella is going to be also proximal to the toes, right? It's also going to be proximal to the toes because again, patella is here, that's your kneecap, your toes are down here, The kneecap is closer to the rest of the body than the toes are, right? So these are some of the questions that you'll encounter. And so, yeah, so here are more questions for you to practice with. So just make sure that you're understanding the answer, right? Don't just memorize, because the question might not be the same every time, right? So make sure you really try to understand. So for example, the nose, where's the nose? The nose is medial to the eyes, right? The eyes are lateral, right? Remember, there's a midline here. The nose is right on that midline. So the nose is the most medial structure. The eyes are more lateral, right? They're on either side of the midline. So we can say that the nose is medial to the eyes, and the nose is also going to be anterior to the back of the head, right? What's another word for anterior? Ventral, right? So that's why both these answers are correct. So I want to move now on to the different planes of the body. So you should be familiar with these planes. Be really, really familiar with these planes. And so if I show you a picture like this, you should be able to tell me that this is a frontal plane. Right? If I showed you this picture, frontal plane, most of your MRI scans are going to be in this plane. They're going to be in this frontal plane, and that frontal plane is the best because you can see pretty much everything. Right? You see cross sections of pretty much every organ, right? Every body part. So this is the frontal plane, also called the coronal plane. Imagine that we are cutting the body such that we are dividing it into an anterior portion and a posterior portion, right? So this plane is referring to this purple rectangle here. So know that this is the frontal plane or the coronal plane. It's called the coronal plane because you can place a crown on top of the head and then draw a line down from either side of the crown. I don't know where that terminology came from, but just know that they're the same thing. Frontal coronal planes will divide the body into anterior and posterior halves. And so let's take a look at the sagittal plane. The sagittal plane, you can see, is here. Again, some of the scans might be looking at the sagittal plane. Right, so a sagittal plane, if you look at this blue rectangle here, will divide the body evenly between the left and right side, right? So left and right side are divided, right? So that's why we're able to see inside the cavity here. You can see all these intestines here. You can see a different view of the heart, right? So if I showed you a picture like this, you should be able to tell me that, hey, this is a sagittal plane. You might also see something, this might also be called a mid-sagittal plane. So mid-sagittal is right down the midline. But if we imagine moving this entire plane from left to right, then you'll have different views, right? If you move this plane laterally, like this rectangle laterally, you're gonna get different views of the organs, right? If you move this plane more, for example, if you move this entire sagittal plane more to the right, you're gonna get cross sections of the liver, right? If you move this sagittal plane more to the left, you're gonna get cross sections of the stomach and the spleen, right? And again, this will make more sense once you start looking at images. But lastly, the other plane that we have is the transverse plane. And if we look at different CT scans, MRI scans, some of them will be in this transverse plane, as you can see here. So again, this transverse plane will cut the body into top and bottom, or superior and inferior halves, right? So you get to see the inside and cross section. So if you're like a radiologist, you can actually, as the person goes through the machine, it goes through like the MRI or the CT scan or something like that, you can actually see, you can scroll through and see pictures, slices of the body, and you can pick out like anomalies that way. So just make sure, because for example, like I said before, this is a picture that I can show you. Tell me what kind of cut this is, what kind of plane this is. And you should be able to tell me that this is like a frontal or a coronal plane. And what will the coronal plane split the body into? You should know that it splits the body into anterior and posterior portions, right? Like if I go back to the picture to show you, it's going to split the body into anterior, posterior portions. And remember that anterior and ventral mean the same thing. Dorsal and posterior mean the same thing. The way I remember dorsal and ventral is I think of like a dorsal hole on a dolphin. It's like on the back of the dolphin. Dorsal means the back. Ventral means the belly, right? So dorsal is posterior. Think of like a dorsal fin or dorsal hole. And then ventral is the opposite. It's going to be the belly portion, right? So that's pretty much the end of chapter 1 for the most part. As you can see, in my opinion, I think chapter 1 is pretty high up there in terms of relevance. Just like knowing the different terms for the body and knowing the different planes. As we start to look at scans, this is going to help a lot to identify, well, is this scan a sagittal scan? Is this a coronal or frontal scan? Or is this like a transverse view of the body? Right? So you should be able to immediately look at that scan, and that's the first thing you should think of, like just automatically. Like, oh, this is, if I give you a scan to look like this, you should know, okay, this is a coronal view of the body, right? Should be instantaneous. So let's start at chapter 5 with the remaining time. We have like 30 minutes left. So chapter 5, again, we're going to take a look at our first organ system, which is going to be the skin. And the skin is made up of all these different things. You'll have epithelial tissue, you have connective tissue, you have muscle tissue, neural tissue. A minute. Is chapter 5 this? Yeah, I want to make sure. Wait, did we? Ooh, okay. Let me make sure that I have the right, because I just edited these for my, okay, wait. Okay, it's here, it's here. Okay, I just have like the wrong slides open, but the skin is actually chapter 6, so. All right, chapter 6. The skin's also it's called the integumentary system. So let's talk about some general functions of the skin. It's a barrier, right, against harmful microbes. It's one of our first lines of defense against anything that tries to invade the body, right? So it's very important that the skin remains intact, right? We don't want any damage to the skin, because that damaged area can be a potential breeding ground for infection. So we don't want that. We want to make sure the skin is complete, is whole. And that's also the reason why burn victims, they suffer from an infection so easily. It's because depending on the degree and severity of the burn, that skin is exposed, and that exposed skin is a breeding ground for infection, and microbes and things can make their way into the body via that damaged skin. So the skin is a very important part of the body. It's, again, the first line of defense against anything that we encounter on a day-to-day basis. Another thing that the skin does is prevents water loss, right? We ourselves, we're 60% water. So it's important that we try to prevent this water from evaporating, right? The skin is like a sac that will contain this water for us. As we know, the skin has all these sensory receptors. This is where your touch sense is located. You have thermal receptors in the skin. You have receptors that respond to all different types of touch, all these different types of tactile sensations. All those things are located in the skin, right? The one function that people don't really think about is the excretory function of the skin. So the skin actually excretes waste. Urea is a byproduct of protein digestion. So some of the urea can actually be excreted out through the surface of the skin. Majority of the urea, however, is urinated out, because the urea is filtered by the kidneys and then excreted out into the urine. But some of it can leave the skin as well. So the other thing that skin does is helps produce vitamin D. So vitamin D is important for a lot of different things. Vitamin D helps with the absorption of calcium, which is why when you buy your calcium supplements, the majority of them will have vitamin D in there, because vitamin D helps with calcium absorption. Vitamin D has also been implicated in a lot of mood disorders. So for example, if you live in the East Coast, they have a higher incidence of like seasonal depression. It's because in order for us to make vitamin D, we need sunlight. And so if you're on the East Coast, you're not getting too much sunlight, you're not going to be making a lot of vitamin D. Therefore, you're actually going to feel very depressed and have a very low mood. Right? That's how important vitamin D is. And then also, the skin is there to regulate body temperature, right? As we talked about before, sweating occurs here on the skin. And yeah, so like also, if you work in an office from like the majority of the day, if you're like inside a majority of the day, it's important that you kind of step out and get some sunlight. Otherwise, you'll feel depressed, right? Because imagine if you go in to the office and it's dark out when you leave the house, and you leave and it's dark out when you leave, you're not really getting that sun exposure that you need. So we already talked about heat loss, so I'm not going to talk about this again, but the skin is important for that. There's different methods to heat loss that your book might have mentioned. Radiation is when the heat just escapes. And typically what happens is when the body gets hot, the blood vessels will dilate, and that's going to allow radiation to occur. So the heat just leaves the body. Conduction can also occur if you ever put like a cold pack on your face. The heat from the skin will move to cooler objects, right? It's going to move to that cold pack. So that's how we get rid of, like if you're feverish, right, and you want to try to lower the body temperature, you put a cold pack on someone, the heat from the body will go towards the cooler object, which is going to be the cold pack. There's also convection, which is basically describing how hot air rises, cold air falls. So convection describes how the air near your skin is going to get heated, and eventually it'll start to rise as it absorbs more and more heat from your skin. So the air will rise, and then as hot air rises, cold air sinks. And so that is one way in which we lose heat as well. This is called convection, right? One way to remember this is think of like a hot air balloon. The reasons why hot air balloons are able to fly is because hot air rises, right? There's also evaporation, which we already talked about, when the skin will excrete sweats, and the heat will then convert that sweat to gas, and that will carry the heat away. Right? That's how sweat works. Sweat is like a liquid, right? It's water. And so water has a very high melting temperature. And so the heat will go towards trying to evaporate that water. And as the sweat evaporates, so does the heat. The heat kind of dissipates with it. And so here is something that we've already talked about, so I'm not going to talk about it any further. You should already be familiar with how to read these body temperature homeostasis diagrams. But I do want to talk about the skin. So let's talk about the skin, let's talk about different structures of the skin. The skin is sometimes called the cutaneous membrane. The cutaneous membrane contains the epidermis and the dermis. Right? And within the dermis, you can see that the dermis is broken down into the papillary layer and the reticular layer. And beneath the cutaneous membrane is something that we call the hypodermis. Right? So if this is the dermis, the hypodermis is the layer that is below the dermis. And so the hypodermis is not considered a part of the skin. And so let's look at the different accessory structures. You have the hair, you have pores for sweat, you have touch receptors, then you have the sebaceous glands that'll secrete sebum, and sebum is this oil that'll help to waterproof the skin. You have the erector pili muscle. This muscle here is what allows your hair to stand up. You have the sweat gland, which produces the sweat. You have the hair follicle, you have pressure receptors deep within the dermis layer that respond to pressure touch. You have nerve fibers, nerve endings that respond to pain. And then of course you have your sweat gland, which is down here. Produces the sweat gland travels up the gland duct pathway, and then it's gonna emerge on the surface of the skin. So different layers of the skin, you have the epidermis, you have the dermis, and then you have the subcutaneous layer, this hypodermis. And again, I want to highlight the fact that the subcutaneous layer, also referred to as the hypodermis, is not considered a part of the skin, right? So the only parts of the skin are the epidermis and the dermis. So epi, again, like I mentioned before, this means on top of, right? So this literally means the layer that is on top of the dermis. So epidermis is the outer layer. It is made up of the stratified squamous epithelium. these, you can see here, stratified means that there's multiple layers of cells. Squamous means that the cells are very thin, very like fish scales, and that is the main cell type of the epidermis, right? And the reason why is because it's multi-layered for protection. This top layer here is actually dead skin, and this dead skin will be removed whenever you like towel off, or it's actually being removed right now, and you just sitting there. Flakes of this dead skin is coming off of you. So you also have something called a basement membrane, which is going to be the divider between the epidermis and the dermis. So if we look at this cross section of skin here, it's been stained with a special type of dye that allows us to visualize the structures of the skin. So the epidermis is in dark purple, and then the dermis itself is in this kind of pinkish color. The divide between the epidermis and dermis is called the basement membrane, which is here. Right. And each one of these little purple dots that you see, these are individual cells. And we'll talk about the implications of this in the next slide. So you have the dermis, which is the deeper layer, right? This is the superficial layer. This is the deeper layer. It's going to be thicker. It's going to have connective tissue and contain collagen and elastic fibers. Right? So those are the main proteins that make up the dermis, the collagen and elastic fibers, to give the skin that stretchiness, that flexibility. And then below your dermis layer, you have the subcutaneous layer called the hypodermis. Right? This is the insulating layer because this is where the fat is located. You have your areolar and your adipose connective tissue down here. It's not considered a part of the skin. Again, I want to highlight this fact. And it contains blood vessels that supply the skin. The thing about the epidermis is that it has very few blood vessels. It's actually relying on these deeper layers for its supply of blood. And so the subcutaneous layer is actually very rich in blood. So if we look at the epidermis first, it gets a little bit more complicated because the epidermis is made up of these distinct layers. So the layer that is closest, or the layer that is deepest, is called the basal layer, the stratum basal layer, deepest layer. This is also where the cells are dividing. Right? This is where all your skin cells are dividing. As skin cells divide, as new cells are formed, they're going to push the older cells further up. And the further up they are pushed, the farther they are from their blood supply, right? Remember, their blood supply is here in the dermis/hypodermis layer. When these new cells are formed, the older cells are pushed further and further up, and they lose their connection to their blood supply and they die, right? Which is why the skin cells that are on the surface, they're dead, right? Because they're so far from their blood supply. Some other things I want to mention that is down here as well in this deep layer is your melanocytes. Your melanocytes are cells that produce melanin, and melanin is the determinant for your skin color, right? So don't confuse this with melatonin. Melatonin is like the sleepy hormone. Melanin is responsible for your skin pigmentation, right? So people who have darker skin, their melanocytes just produce more melanin. So down here, I don't care if you know this, but there's these touch receptor cells deep down here as well. Then you have the keratinocytes. The keratinocytes are here in this other layer that is more superficial. So you have the basal layer, and then you have the spinosum layer. And this is where your keratinocytes are located. And these keratinocytes are held together by desmosomes, which we've talked about. They connect cells, right? Specifically skin cells. The desmosomes will connect cells to each other. And these keratinocytes, they produce keratin. So you can see that they are found in this granulosum layer as well, which is another layer up. And these keratinocytes produce keratin, and the keratin protein that they produce will actually help to waterproof and make the upper layers of skin more sturdy. Right? So these keratinocytes, they make keratin that'll be passed along to the more superficial skin cells, making them waterproof and much more sturdy. So if you go up another layer, you have the lucidum layer, which is a layer that we only see in the palms of the hand and the soles of the feet. Right? Every other place in the body only has 4 layers of skin. but the skin that is on the palms of your hand and the soles of your feet, there's 5 layers there. There's an additional lucidum layer. And then you have the corneum layer, which is going to be the most superficial part of the epidermis. This is where you have your dead cells. And you have all these cells here that are also water resistant because of the keratinocytes. Like these skin cells here are loaded with keratin. And so that's going to make them water resistant. And so this question here, the epidermal layer that contains germ cells that undergo mitosis and melanocytes. So germ cells are just cells that divide a lot. Right? So what layer can we find these cells in? And that's going to be the basal layer, right? As I mentioned before. So that's an important thing to know. The basal layer is where all the new skin cells are being made. And this I already mentioned, the thicker parts of the body, like the palms of the hand and sole, and the bottom of the feet, we have an initial layer called the lucidum layer. And so there's, at these specific parts of the body, you're gonna have 5 layers of skin. 5 layers of epidermis, sorry. So melanocytes, I kind of talked about, this is what they look like. They pass melanin onto the more superficial skin cells, right? So you can see here, they have melanin that they produce, and the melanin is responsible for your hair color, your eye color, and your skin color. And when you expose yourself to UV lights, that'll actually trigger the synthesis of melanin. And that's why we kind of get darker. If you've ever been on like a vacation where you're just kind of outside for the most part, you notice that your skin gets darker and darker. It's because your melanocytes realize that we were getting more and more UV ray exposure. And so in order to protect the germ cells, in order to protect this layer here, this bottom layer from UV rays, the melanocytes are going to produce melanin, and melanin will help to protect the skin from UV rays. The reason why we need to protect this layer is because, remember, this is where the cells are dividing, right? And so when these cells are actively dividing and they're hit by UV rays are very mutagenic. So they're going to mutate the DNA of these cells. And it's even worse in cells that constantly divide, right? Cells that are constantly just dividing, when you mutate their DNA, that can cause cancer. So the cells can be just cancerous and basically divide out of control, essentially. So we want to protect this bottom layer here, which is why we produce melanin. Okay? And the more UV ray you subject yourself to, the more melanin your melanocytes are gonna make. So in this particular condition called incontinentia pigmenti, the skin has these dark splotches because melanin has penetrated the dermal layer. Where should melanin only be found? Where should melanin only be found? So I'm gonna give you guys a chance to think about this. You might want to reference the previous slide and we'll talk about it. All right, and so let's take a look at this. So we know that melanocytes are in the epidermal layer, right? They're in the deepest parts of the epidermal layer, right? They're in the stratum basal along with the other germ cells. And so why are these dark splotches here? It's because the melanin has made its way into the dermal layer, right? Which is an area where they are not supposed to be. They are supposed to be in the epidermal layer, right? If you think about it, the melanin, when it's in the dermal layer, it's not doing what it's supposed to be doing, right? Remember, it's supposed to be protecting the cells in the basal layer. If the melanin is deep, that means that these cells are exposed to the UV rays. Melanin should always be in the epidermal layer, right? Where it can protect these basal cells from being mutated by the UV lights. Yeah. So a person who's engaged in sun tanning is most likely to have what's of the following: increased. So don't worry about this question actually, because we decided to remove the whole like transcription translation part. So we're not going to focus on that question. So ignore this question. It's not going to be on your quiz or anything. So I just want to highlight you guys the importance of wearing sunscreen, right? So this picture here actually made it on the front cover of like Times Magazine or some other magazine. But it shows you the severity of UV rays, right? So this guy was a truck driver, and you can imagine that as a truck driver, you're on the road constantly, and one side of your face will always be exposed to the UV rays, right? Specifically your left side, right? Because that's the driver's side. Obviously he did not put on any sunscreen or any skin protectants. And the thing is that UV rays can cause premature aging as well as skin cancer. And so you can see that here, right? Compare his left side to his right side. That's a pretty dramatic difference, right? So that's why it's important to always wear sunscreen when you're out in the sun. And again, you want to minimize exposure to UV rays because this can increase your risk of cancer, right? So always put sunscreen on, even when it's overcast. The UV rays can still penetrate through the clouds, and they have a chance of causing premature aging, wrinkles, right? No one wants that. I want to look young forever, so make sure to put sunscreen on. So let's talk about the dermis layer. So this is below the epidermis. Here are the things you can find there. You can see that there's a lot of stuff there. Way more stuff than what we found in the dermis layer. You have some blood vessels, you have follicles, you have sweat and sebaceous glands. There's two layers to the to the dermis. The more superficial layer of the dermis is called is papillary layer. So papillary layer is a superficial layer. The reticular layer is the deeper layer. And you can see that it's made up of different types of tissues. Honestly, FYI, it's like an FYI thing. You don't memorize this because it's getting a little bit too into the detail. But just know that the dermis has the blood vessels, has the hair follicles, sweat sebaceous glands, and also has all your touch receptors, right? It has pressure receptors that detect pressure, and it has other receptors for more tactile, more superficial tactile touch, so like light touch. So you don't have to know the names of these, just know that sensory receptors are also present on the dermis. So here's a fun question to think about. I don't know how many of you guys have tattoos, but when you're getting a tattoo, why does it hurt so much? It hurts a lot because we are, or the tattoo artist is, trying to deposit that ink deep into the dermis layer, right? You don't want the tattoo here in the epidermis, because what did we learn about the epidermis? There's a high rate of cell turnover, meaning that the cells that are here are always being replaced by newer cells, right? So if you put ink here, if you're too superficial with your needle, the ink will actually eventually disappear over time, right? So the reason why it hurts is because the ink has to be deposited in the dermis layer of the skin. And think about what else is in the dermis layer of the skin. This is where all your nerve endings are, right? That respond to pain. So that's why it's so painful. So you really want it in your dermis layer. So I know the answer didn't pop up, but this is going to be the dermis layer. Okay, 7 minutes left. So some accessory structures that you should be aware of. And again, all these accessory structures are in the dermis layer. None of the accessory structures are in or originate from the epidermis, right? So these all originate from the dermis layer. So you have hair follicles, you have nails, and then you have sebaceous glands, which produce sebum, and that helps to kind of waterproof and make the skin more water resistant. When we get acne, sometimes it's because of too much sebum buildup, and this happens particularly around puberty. Your sebaceous glands just become overproductive. They produce too much sebum and they get clogged, and that can be a cause for acne. Yeah, so high levels of testosterone can overstimulate the sebaceous glands. The glands are clogged with sebum, and this is gonna attract a lot of bacteria that live on top of your skin. And these bacteria are gonna start feeding on the sebum. So this is going to trigger an inflammatory response from the body, and that's what the pimples are, the redheads are. That's due to the inflammation of the presence of the bacteria. And so what can we do to treat? We have vitamin A derivatives. You guys have probably heard of retinol. Very effective treatments against acne, as well as a very good anti-aging ingredients in a lot of skincare products. Antibiotics, why don't we just kill off the bacteria? This has also been proven to be very effective to fighting acne. And then you have salicylic acid, which also has antibacterial properties. So pretty much common stuff that you see. You go buy your skincare products. So sebum, we know, is secreted from the sebaceous glands, and it serves to waterproof the skin. So you should still know what hydrophilic, what polar means, what hydrophobic means. And so this is a reminder of that. So if sebum is waterproofing the skin, it has to be hydrophobic, right? It cannot interact with the water, right? Just think about waxing your car. Like, what's the purpose of waxing your car? The wax basically helps to prevent water from accumulating onto the surface of your car, right? And so the sebum kind of acts the same way. It prevents water from accumulating on the surface of the skin. And then you have more accessory structures here. You get the sweat glands, also known as the sudoriferous glands, and they can either originate in the dermis or hypodermis. And there's two types of sweat glands. We have the eccrine sweat glands, also called the merocrine sweat glands. These sweat glands are basically everywhere in the body, and they respond to increases in body temperature. So when your body temperature increases, right, what happens? You guys should be pros at this. We start sweating, right? We start sweating a lot. And the sweat is coming from these eccrine glands. There's another type of sweat gland called the apocrine sweat gland. And this is basically found in all the stinky places of your body, like the really smelly places, like your armpit area, the axillary area, the groin area. And these sweat glands are activated during puberty, and they'll stay activated. And this is where the smell comes from. These apocrine sweat glands release sweat, and they also release a bed of protein, a bed of cell fragments along in the sweat. And so what this does is that the protein actually attracts a lot of bacteria, and the bacteria, when they're eating these proteins that are in the sweats produced by the apocrine glands, they will actually start to produce gas, right? And that's where BO comes from. The BO actually comes from the bacteria that is eating the sweats produced by the apocrine gland. And so what a lot of people have done, and this is a fairly recent thing, is that they do like laser therapy now to kind of get rid of these glands. And so that these glands, once they're inactivated, your sweat no longer produces any body odor. So it's a pretty interesting thing to look into, I guess. If you want to stop buying deodorants, you can just laser and kill off these glands, and so that you don't produce any more of this sweat, and this will prevent the bacteria from just congregating in your axillary region. Some other things to be aware of: ceruminous glands are your earwax, produce earwax. Serum actually is earwax, so CERUM is earwax. You have mammary glands as well, which we'll talk about when we talk about pregnancy. Here's a summarization table of all of that. I believe we have to, yeah, and then this here, you can pretty much read, but this is how a wound heals. And of course, we have shallow cuts and deep cuts. Deep cuts meaning that they penetrate the dermis and subcutaneous layers and result in damage of a lot of blood vessels. So the healing process. What happens? You have the clots formation made up of this fibrin protein, and the clot is actually made up of a bunch of blood cells and platelets that get trapped by the fibrin as well. And eventually a scab is supposed to form. And then you have cells that are working behind the scenes. So you have the scab here, right? But that does not mean that the tissue has finished healing, because all the healing is still undergoing. It's still occurring beneath the skin. So you can see here that the fibroblasts, which are a type of cell, these cells produce collagen to bind the wound together. You have growth factors as well that are basically proteins that will stimulate new tissues to be formed. And then you have white blood cells that remove the dead cells and debris. And eventually the scab is supposed to come off. And so where does scarring occur from? It occurs from excess collagenous fibers. Right? So whenever your body produces too much this collagenous, whenever too much collagen is made, that can actually form a scar. And again, UV rays have been shown to stimulate the production of collagenous fibers, right? And so basically what that means is that when you like pop that pimple on your face, you should put on sunscreen before going outside because UV rays have been shown to overstimulate collagen production. When you have too much collagen being made, that's going to result in a scar. And that's also important to not remove the scab prematurely, because if you do that, that can also stimulate excess collagen fiber generation. And that's, of course, can lead to a scar as well. So that's pretty much all we have time for. This last part's about burns, which you guys can read from your book or from the slides. So if you have any questions, feel free to stay. And like I said before, I'm going to open up the practice quiz today as soon as we conclude. So you guys are totally free to go. Thank you for participating. And let me know if there are any issues with the exam. So yeah, any questions, concerns before we conclude?
Yeah, I had a quick question in regards to the weekly quiz. I didn't see any of that in the on our assignments list.
Yeah, so I'm gonna upload it as soon as we finish the session. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
It's not really a weekly. It's like an exam because it's like all these chapters. So it's it's like instead of a weekly quiz, it's like a weekly exam. But yeah, it'll be posted.
The entire month.
Yeah. So everything we've covered so far, 8 questions per chapter, and 1 minute 20 seconds per question. So that's plenty of time.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Any other questions, concerns? Okay. All right. So I'm gonna post the practice quiz so you guys can look at that. I highly encourage you guys to attempt that before actually diving into the actual exam itself. Okay, because that's gonna help a lot. Okay, one final. So 8 questions per chapter. I kind of lost track of how many chapters we had, but just know however chapters we've covered so far, there's gonna be 8 questions. I'm gonna take a look. If totally forgot like how many chapters we covered, but 8 questions roughly per chapter, and again 1 minute and 20 seconds per question. So and the practice quiz that I'm making is basically a model of that. So that is gonna, if you want to time yourself, you can, but yeah, so that includes like this week's chapters as well. Yeah, you can take it as many times as you want for the practice quiz, not the actual exam, but the practice exam. Yeah, so we've covered pretty much like 2 chapters per week. So so 8 sounds right.